Bumpy Johnson walked out of Alcatraz after 11 years with nothing. No money, no army, no territory. Everything he built had been taken by a man richer, younger, and better armed than him. But instead of fighting back, Bumpy simply smiled. And within months, his enemy's empire began collapsing from the inside without a single confrontation. What did Bumpy do that made a man with everything surrender without a fight to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. The morning they put the handcuffs on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Harlem did not riot. It did not march. It did not even raise its voice. The neighborhood that had absorbed decades of violence, that had buried its sons in unmarked graves and sung gospel over men who died with their boots on that Harlem, simply stood on the sidewalk and watched. Store owners frozen in their doorways, old women pausing mid-step on the way to church, young men leaning against brick walls with their hands deep in their pockets, watching the federal agents guide Bumpy into a dark government car on a cool Tuesday morning in the spring of 1952, as if they were watching a building being demolished, understanding instinctively that what stood there would never be rebuilt the same way, and not yet fully grasping what that absence would cost every single one of them. No one cried, not publicly, not where anyone could see, because crying would have required admitting what everyone already knew, but could not yet bring themselves to say out loud that the man who had held Harlem together with equal parts authority and genuine protection, who had been the invisible architecture beneath the neighborhood's chaotic surface for more than 20 years, was gone. And when a structure disappears, everything built on top of it does not fall immediately. It sways first. It leans at angles that seem manageable. And then, without warning, without ceremony, it collapses entirely from the inside out, starting precisely from the places where the weight had always been greatest and the dependencies had always been deepest. The collapse began in less than 24 hours, and it began not from outside, but from within. 3 of Bumpy's most senior lieutenant's men who had eaten at his table executed his decisions and built their own modest reputations entirely within the shelter of his considerably larger one began moving against each other before the government car carrying their former boss had cleared the end of the block. Raymond Ellis Dazur, who controlled the gambling operations on Harlem's west side, sent 2 men to redirect collections from a numbers runner who answered directly to Marcus Webb, Bumpy's second most trusted operational figure. Webb discovered the interference by noon. By early evening, a message had been delivered to Ellis's building on Lenox Avenue that required no verbal elaboration and left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The third man, a quietly dangerous figure named Cornelius Price, who managed Bumpy's protection arrangements across East Harlem, simply stopped answering his telephone entirely and began conducting a series of private meetings with people he had no legitimate reason to be seen with. 3 men, 20 years of enforced loyalty, 24 hours of absence. The arithmetic of power, when its center suddenly vanishes, is brutal in its speed and entirely predictable to anyone who has studied carefully how empires actually end, not in dramatic final confrontations, not in cinematic last stands, but in the accelerating, ugly, small betrayals of men who mistake opportunity for courage and self-interest for strategic thinking. What none of those 3 men understood, in their first frantic hours of maneuvering and positioning and calculating, was that their infighting was not merely destroying Bumpy Johnson's organization from within. It was broadcasting that destruction clearly, loudly, with perfect visibility to every observer in New York City who had the intelligence to recognize what they were seeing. And there was one man in Brooklyn who had been watching Harlem with sustained, patient, entirely undisclosed attention for a very long time. Vincent Caruso was 41 years old in the spring of 1952, and he was not what most people imagined when they pictured the kind of man who moves decisively into a power vacuum and makes it permanently his own. He was not physically imposing. He was not given to theatrical displays of dominance or loud demonstrations of authority. He wore suits that cost more than most Harlem residents earned in 3 months, spoke in the measured and unhurried cadence of a man who had never in his adult life felt the need to raise his voice to make a point land with precision, and possessed a quality of stillness in conversation that most people found unsettling without being able to explain exactly why. He had grown up in a Brooklyn household with connections to larger Italian organizations, had watched from childhood how real power was accumulated and maintained and eventually lost, and had arrived at a conclusion that most men in his world never successfully reached that violence was the most expensive currency available to anyone operating in the shadows. Every time you spent it, you generated unpredictable debts, created visible enemies who had now been given a reason to be permanent, and attracted official attention that complicated every downstream operation indefinitely. Caruso preferred instruments that left fewer marks. He preferred money, which was cleaner. He preferred patience, which in his world was considerably rarer than physical courage. And he possessed a specific, cultivated quality of intelligence that allowed him to watch other people systematically dismantle themselves and simply wait without impatience, without intervention, without revealing his attention until the wreckage settled and the inventory could be taken. He had been studying Harlem for 3 full years before Bumpy's arrest. Not aggressively, not in any manner that the people he was studying would have detected or recognized. He had been mapping the neighborhood's financial and social architecture the way a careful engineer examines a complex structure before acquiring the land beneath it, identifying exactly which supports bore the most critical weight, which operational connections were genuinely structural, and which were maintained purely by the daily physical presence of Ellsworth Johnson himself, which relationships would survive a prolonged absence and which would begin dissolving within weeks of one. When the telephone call came on that Tuesday morning, confirming that the arrest had occurred and was proceeding as expected, Caruso received it at his desk, thanked his contact with characteristic brevity, and replaced the receiver without any visible change in expression. He opened a leather-bound notebook to a page covered in his own precise handwriting, a timeline he had been constructing and revising for 18 months, and drew a single clean line through a projected date he had written there. His estimate had been accurate within 3 months. He allowed himself exactly the measure of private satisfaction that the accuracy merited, which was small and brief and entirely internal. And then he went methodically to work. Caruso did not arrive in Harlem with armed men and ultimatums. That approach would have been operationally counterproductive and also, given what was already unfolding naturally, entirely unnecessary. What the situation required was something more precise, a series of targeted and individually invisible interventions, each creating an obligation that would compound quietly over time into something that looked, from the outside, less like conquest and more like natural and inevitable transition. He arranged for a quiet financial payment to resolve the most pressing debt threatening Raymond Ellis, delivered through intermediary channels with no traceable connection to Brooklyn. He provided a legal resolution to a long-standing problem that had been creating serious risk for Marcus Webb, handled through an attorney whose client relationships were kept meticulously compartmentalized. He extended a business arrangement to Cornelius Price that required no explicit conversation about what the arrangement implied going forward, because men like Price had spent entire careers learning to read the language of obligation without needing it spelled out in terms that could later be repeated. 3 men, 3 carefully selected problems solved, 3 critical threads of Bumpy Johnson's operational network, each now connected invisibly, undeniably, with no written record and no usable witnesses to Vincent Caruso's hand. The entire sequence required 6 weeks. Not one explicit threat was made. Not one person was physically harmed. Not one person anywhere in Harlem understood what was happening until it was already completely and irreversibly finished. What made that precision possible, what gave Caruso the interior map he needed to move through Bumpy's organization with the confidence of a man who already knows exactly what he will find behind every door, was information. Specific, current, operationally detailed information about which elements of the organization were most financially significant, which relationships were most vulnerable to the right kind of pressure, which men could be approached through which channels, which parts of the structure would hold under sustained stress, and which would give way with minimal applied force. That information had been flowing from deep inside Bumpy's organization to a desk in Brooklyn for 14 months before the arrest. And the man providing it was not a peripheral figure operating at the margins, not a disgruntled lower-level employee with a manageable grudge. His name was Lester Briggs, for 11 years. He had been Ellsworth Johnson's most trusted and most relied-upon advisor, the man Bumpy consulted before every significant decision, the man who occupied the seat of most authority at every important meeting, the man whose judgment Bumpy had described to multiple people, on multiple occasions spanning many years, as the clearest and most reliable thinking he had encountered across 3 decades of operating in New York's underworld. Briggs was 53 years old, wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of an academic, and spoke with the careful, considered precision of a man who had educated himself entirely through public libraries, because every other avenue had been closed to him by circumstances of birth and era. He was not corrupt in any simple or obvious sense. He had not sold information out of financial desperation or naked greed for things he could not otherwise afford. He had sold it slowly, methodically, over months, having constructed for himself a private justification that he had apparently found sufficient. Though whether he had fully convinced his own conscience was a question his subsequent behavior never cleanly answered. What the evidence answered with complete clarity was that for 14 months, every significant strategic decision Bumpy Johnson made had been known in advance by Vincent Caruso, and every meaningful vulnerability in Bumpy's organization had been cataloged, assessed, and filed for eventual use. When the arrest provided the opening, that catalog became the operational blueprint for everything that followed. When the truth about Briggs finally surfaced, not in a single revelation, but in fragments accumulated over months, through details that no other explanation could account for, what it produced in Harlem was not, primarily, rage. The rage came later, in its own time, in its own forms. What came first was something quieter and considerably more damaging, a specific quality of grief that attaches not to what was lost, but to the full comprehension of how completely it had been possible to be deceived by the person trusted most completely and for the longest time. If Briggs could be turned so thoroughly, then proximity to power was not safety, it was exposure. If the man who had known Bumpy Johnson most completely had been working systematically against everything Bumpy built while appearing to be its most reliable support, then the entire framework of trust on which the organization had operated required re-examination from its foundation. Harlem did not lose only territory through Lester Briggs's choices. It lost the confidence that had made the territory feel like something more substantial than a collection of financial arrangements. And that particular loss cut deeper and healed considerably more slowly than anything Caruso's money had purchased or engineered. What Caruso built on that foundation was, in its cold and efficient way, a fully functioning operation. He managed Harlem the way a competent executive manages an acquisition professionally, profitably, with zero emotional investment in the people who generated the revenue and zero interest in the neighborhood's life beyond what it produced financially. The gambling operations continued because they were profitable, and disrupting them would have created unnecessary complications. The protection arrangements continued for the same reason. The informal financial services that Bumpy had operated with a genuine element of community support continued in significantly reduced form. stripped of the paternal generosity that had given them meaning beyond pure extraction, and made them something other than simply another mechanism of control. Everything functioned with mechanical reliability. Nothing breathed with any recognizable life. The streets under Caruso's management were orderly in precisely the way that occupied territory is orderly, because the consequences of disorder had been made sufficiently clear and the calculation had been made, by enough people on enough mornings, that compliance required less than resistance. Collections arrived on schedule. Money moved through its channels without interruption. The operation produced consistent returns that satisfied everyone whose satisfaction Caruso considered relevant. But Harlem's residents, who had lived under Bumpy Johnson's presence long enough to understand viscerally the difference between a man who controlled a neighborhood and a man who genuinely belonged to it, felt the distinction every day in ways they could not always articulate, but never stopped registering. They answered questions with the minimum information required and not one word more. They maintained elaborate, invisible networks of warning and communication that Caruso's people could not penetrate because they had not grown up learning the language those networks operated in. They complied with every visible requirement of Caruso's authority while preserving, beneath that surface of compliance, an interior life of loyalty and resistance that his ledgers could measure the financial output of, but could never actually reach or redirect. Because Caruso, for all the genuine sophistication of his intelligence, had made the fundamental error of treating a community as a market. Markets respond to price signals and incentive structures. Communities respond to something older and less reducible, something that lives in the accumulated memory of shared experience and cannot be purchased at any price or engineered through any mechanism available to a man who came from somewhere else and intended, always, to treat the place as an asset rather than a home. The formal declaration of Caruso's ownership came on a Friday evening in October 1954 at a restaurant on West 116th Street that Harlem knew as the Monarch. Bumpy Johnson had eaten there no fewer than 3 times a week for 15 years. He had settled neighborhood disputes across its tables, conducted the most sensitive business of his operation in its back rooms, received visitors who came from across New York City to seek his counsel or his authorization or simply the acknowledgement that his presence represented. The Monarch was not merely a location in Bumpy's life. It was the most visible and recognizable symbol of his authority, a place so thoroughly and for so long identified with him that his regular corner table near the window had acquired, in Harlem's collective imagination, the kind of significance that attaches only to spaces where real power has been exercised consistently and for long enough to feel permanent. Caruso reserved the entire establishment for the evening. He sent invitations printed on heavy cardstock to every significant figure in New York's underworld Italian families from Lower Manhattan and the Bronx, Irish operations from the West Side, and the men of Harlem who had transferred their allegiance over the preceding 2 years and required a public occasion to formally confirm what had previously been conducted in careful private. He hired musicians. He arranged for the finest available food and drink. He stood at the entrance as his guests arrived and received each one with the calm, proprietorial assurance of a man who harbors no doubt whatsoever about the permanence of what surrounds him. Every person who walked through that door understood the choice of location without being told. Caruso had not selected the Monarch for its cuisine or its atmosphere. He had selected it because the act of hosting New York's underworld at Bumpy Johnson's table, in Bumpy Johnson's restaurant, on Bumpy Johnson's street, surrounded by men who had once answered to Bumpy and had since redirected, that answer was a declaration requiring no elaboration and permitting no ambiguity. The previous era was finished. The new one had been operational for 2 years and was now being publicly and permanently acknowledged. Anyone who retained attachment to what had come before was free to carry that privately. But the public record being created in this room on this night pointed in one direction only, and that direction did not include Ellsworth Johnson. The evening concluded without incident. Photographs were taken, glasses were raised, Conversations between powerful men produced agreements and understandings that would shape the next several years of the city's shadow economy. And by the time the last guest had departed into the October night, the story those photographs told had already begun its journey through every channel by which consequential information traveled in their world outward through the city, across state lines, into federal facilities, into the particular informal networks that connected the incarcerated to the events occurring in their absence. 3 weeks later, folded inside a newspaper with no accompanying note and no indication of its sender, a single image arrived at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. It showed Vincent Caruso standing at the entrance of the Monarch, hands clasped loosely in front of him, surrounded by the most powerful men in New York's underworld, in a room that belonged to another man's history. Someone had drawn a circle around the image in red ink. Nothing else. No message. No explanation. None was needed. Bumpy Johnson held that newspaper without moving for a long time. He read everything available to read the caption. The names. The faces visible in the background. The details of the room behind Caruso's shoulder that told him more than any caption could about the specific and complete nature of what had occurred in his absence. He looked at his table in the corner near the window, occupied now by men who had made their calculations and their choices, framed by walls that had heard 20 years of his voice and now heard someone else's entirely. Then he folded the newspaper along its creases, set it down with the quiet deliberateness of a man placing something precisely where he means to return to it, and was still. And then he smiled. Those who had known Ellsworth Johnson across 2 full decades, who had watched him navigate pressures that would have destroyed men of lesser composure, who understood the specific grammar of his expressions and what each one actually meant beneath its surface, would have recognized that smile immediately and found it more arresting than any display of anger he might have produced instead. It was not a mask constructed over pain. It was not defiance performing itself for an absent audience. It was the unmistakable expression of a man who has just received confirmation of something he already understood at a level beneath conscious thought, and whose path forward has become not more obstructed, but more clear. It was the expression, in other words, of a man already thinking well past the moment that everyone else had accepted as a conclusion, toward an ending that no one else had yet begun to conceive. The guard who collected newspapers the following morning found the cell orderly and its occupant composed. Hands folded, expression giving away nothing. The newspaper sat in the collection pile, folded neatly, the circled photograph facing downward. Vincent Caruso, at that precise moment, was sleeping soundly in a building 12 blocks from the Monarch, satisfied that the story he had written was complete. He did not know that 900 miles away, in a cell on an island in San Francisco Bay, a 50-year-old man had just folded a newspaper and begun with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the right plan started early enough, requires no urgency at all to write the chapter that Caruso would never see coming until it had already, quietly and completely, arrived. He rode the bus back to Harlem on a November morning in 1963, carrying a single bag, wearing a coat that had been purchased for a man 11 years younger, sitting in an ordinary seat among ordinary passengers who did not know his name. No one met him at the gate. No cars waited at the curb. No delegation of lieutenants stood ready to escort him back to the neighborhood that had once organized itself around his presence, the way a solar system organizes itself around the body with the most gravity. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 58 years old, returned to Harlem the way a man returns from a long journey that no one except himself fully understood, quietly, without ceremony, carrying everything that mattered in the interior rather than on the surface. Within 6 hours, the neighborhood knew he was back, not because he announced it, not because anyone held a gathering or circulated a message or made any formal declaration of his return. The information traveled the way. Important information always traveled in Harlem, person to person, corner to corner, through the invisible network of communication that had existed in the neighborhood for decades, and that no outside force had ever successfully mapped or interrupted. A woman who recognized him on 125th Street told her nephew. The nephew told 3 men he trusted. Those 3 men each told 2 more. By the time the November sun had begun its early descent, the knowledge that Bumpy Johnson had come home had reached every block, every barber shop, every corner where people gathered to exchange the currency of information that kept a community oriented within its own life. And the effect of that knowledge, the specific shift in atmosphere that accompanied it, the particular quality of attention that the neighborhood suddenly directed toward its own streets and corners and routines, was something that no financial ledger could have measured, and no operational report could have adequately described, because there are men whose names, entirely independent of their current circumstances or their present capacity for action, carry a weight that functions like a change in barometric pressure. You feel it before you can explain it. You adjust your behavior in response to it before you have consciously decided to. Vincent Caruso had money, and organization, and 11 years of established presence, and armed men positioned throughout the neighborhood he had purchased piece by piece. Bumpy Johnson had stepped off a bus with a single bag, and 11 years of accumulated patience, and within 6 hours, Harlem knew in the wordless, collective way that communities know the things that matter most, that the calculation had just changed in ways that were not yet visible, but were already, irreversibly, in motion. Caruso's people reported the return immediately. Caruso received the information, considered it, and made a decision that reflected the logical structure of his intelligence and also, though he could not have recognized it at the time, its most significant limitation. He decided that Bumpy Johnson, at 58, returning from 11 years in federal prison with no organization, no money, no operational infrastructure, and no obvious allies, represented a manageable situation that required monitoring rather than immediate action. The man he was measuring was the man who had left in 1952. He had no framework for accounting for what 11 years of enforced stillness, of sustained observation, of thinking without the noise of daily operations to distract from the deeper work of planning, had produced in the man who was now walking Harlem streets in a coat that was slightly too large for him, and noticing, with precise and unhurried attention, absolutely everything. Bumpy did not move toward territory. He did not approach a single gambling operation, did not make contact with any of the financial networks that had once reported to him, did not send any message to any person in Caruso's organization that could have been interpreted as a challenge or a claim. Instead, he walked. He walked Harlem the way a man walks a neighborhood he loves and has been away from, with the unhurried attention of someone for whom each block contains memories that deserve to be acknowledged before anything else is considered. He stopped at a grocery store on 8th Avenue whose owner, an elderly man named Mr. Patterson, had borrowed money from Bumpy in 1948 and had been carrying the weight of that unresolved debt through 15 years of changed circumstances. Bumpy sat with him for 20 minutes, drank the coffee that was offered, and told Mr. Patterson that the debt was gone, not restructured, not transferred to someone else's ledger. Simply gone. He visited a family on 119th Street whose son had gotten into difficulty with Caruso's people over a sum so small it barely registered as a financial matter, and he resolved it through a conversation rather than a confrontation, leaving the family with their dignity intact and the problem genuinely finished. He appeared at a small church on Lenox Avenue one Sunday morning, sat in the last pew, and after the service spent an hour talking with people he had known for decades about their lives, their children, their concerns not about operations, not about territory, not about the reorganization of any structure that had once been his, about their lives. He did this for weeks, systematically, unhurriedly, without any visible strategic framework, and Harlem began to remember. Not abstractly, not as a matter of nostalgic sentiment for a figure from its past, but concretely in the specific memories of specific people who had experienced specific moments in which Bumpy Johnson's presence had meant something real and irreplaceable. The neighborhood did not merely recall that he had been powerful. It recalled what he had done with that power, and it measured that recollection against 11 years of experiencing what power without that quality felt like. And the comparison produced a response that was quiet and entirely internal and completely beyond anything Caruso's operational structure could detect or interrupt. Harlem was not just remembering, it was choosing. And the choice, once it began to form in the collective conscience of the neighborhood, was not reversible by any instrument that money could purchase. What Caruso could not have anticipated, and what demonstrated the specific depth of Bumpy's understanding of the community he was operating within, was the move that came next, the one that appeared, on its surface, to be the least strategic thing Bumpy Johnson could possibly have done. Lester Briggs was still in Harlem. He had not prospered under the arrangement he had made with Caruso. The compensation he had received for 14 months of betrayal had been spent. His standing in the community had never recovered from the revelation of what he had done, and he lived in a condition of social diminishment that was in many respects more punishing than any formal consequence could have been. He was a man whom Harlem had not forgiven, and Harlem's manner of not forgiving a person was to continue their existence within the community while removing from it every form of warmth and recognition that makes existence within a community tolerable. Briggs moved through the neighborhood like a man moving through a space that has learned to look past him. Bumpy went to see him personally. He arrived unannounced at the small apartment where Briggs was living and knocked on the door the way a man knocks when he is certain the door will be answered and has no need to demonstrate urgency. Briggs opened the door and stood in the frame without speaking, with the expression of a man who has spent years preparing for a confrontation and has never quite succeeded in preparing enough. Bumpy looked at him for a moment, then said, "I'm not here for what you think. Come take a walk with me." They walked for 40 minutes through the streets of Harlem, in full view of everyone who cared to observe. And Bumpy spoke with Briggs in the manner of a man addressing someone with whom he has a complicated history that he has chosen, through considered decision rather than amnesia, to place behind him, at the end of the walk, outside the small church on Lenox Avenue. Bumpy stopped and faced Briggs directly and said, "What you did, you did. I understand why men make the choices they make when they're afraid. I forgive you for it, not for your sake, for mine, and for Harlem's, because this neighborhood has carried that weight long enough." The conversation was witnessed by more people than either man acknowledged. Word of it reached every corner of Harlem by nightfall, not just the fact of the meeting, but the specific quality of what had been said and how it had been said. The particular dignity with which Bumpy Johnson had chosen to absorb a betrayal of that magnitude and respond to it with something that required more genuine strength than retaliation ever would have. Harlem watched this and understood something that it had perhaps always known but now saw, demonstrated with undeniable clarity that the man who had just forgiven his most devastating enemy was operating from a position of interior security, that Caruso, who had built everything he owned on the systematic exploitation of other people's fear, could not touch and could not replicate, and could not, in the final analysis, compete with. The neighborhood had been choosing sides gradually, in small increments, since the day Bumpy stepped off the bus. After the walk with Briggs, it was no longer choosing. It had chosen. What followed was the move that revealed most completely the quality of strategic thinking that Bumpy had spent 11 years in a federal penitentiary, refining to its sharpest possible edge. The rumor began quietly, as the most effective rumors do, in a place where it could be heard by exactly the right people before anyone thought to question its origins. It suggested not loudly, not with any supporting documentation, simply in the register of something that a reliable person had heard from another reliable person, that Bumpy Johnson had been having private conversations with representatives of the Lucchese family regarding a possible arrangement that would give Bumpy operational support in exchange for access to Harlem's financial networks, which the Luccheses had coveted for years. There were no such conversations. There were no such representatives. There was no arrangement in discussion. No meeting scheduled, no preliminary agreement of any kind. There was only the rumor, placed with precision, allowed to travel through the channels it would naturally travel through, and arrive as Bumpy had calculated it would, in approximately the time frame he had estimated at Vincent Caruso's desk. Caruso had built his operation on a foundation of controlled information and managed suspicion. He had survived in his world by never fully trusting anyone and by maintaining constant vigilance against the kind of internal compromise that had, ironically, been the instrument of his own entry into Harlem a decade earlier. When the rumor reached him, it landed in exactly the psychological environment that made it most destructive a mind already primed to believe that the people around him were capable of betrayal. Because he knew from direct experience that everyone was, he did not dismiss the rumor. He could not afford to dismiss it. And the process of investigating it, of looking at the men closest to him, with the particular quality of scrutiny that suspicion produces, was itself the damage that Bumpy had intended to inflict. Within 3 weeks, Caruso had identified 3 men in his inner circle as the most probable sources of the alleged leak to the Luccheses. He removed all 3 from their positions, severing the relationships with a coldness that communicated to everyone remaining in his organization. That proximity to Caruso was not a form of security, but its opposite, that the closer you stood to the center, the more exposed you were to the consequences of his uncertainty. The 3 men he removed were not guilty of anything. None of them had spoken to anyone connected to the Luccheses. None of them had been in contact with Bumpy Johnson. They had simply been in the wrong positions at the moment when their employer's paranoia required targets. And Caruso's need to respond to a threat he could not precisely locate had transformed 3 loyal operators into casualties of his own defensive reflex. The men who remained in Caruso's organization watched this happen and drew the conclusion that any rational person in their position would draw. They began, carefully and quietly, to consider their options. The financial pressure arrived through a different mechanism entirely, applied with the same patience and the same invisible precision that characterized everything Bumpy had done since stepping off the bus that November morning. Harlem's economic infrastructure, the network of suppliers, intermediaries, collectors, and local business owners whose cooperation made Caruso's operation function, was composed largely of people who had been working within that operation, not because they preferred it, but because the alternative had never previously seemed available. They were not Caruso's people, in any meaningful sense. They were people who had accommodated Caruso's presence the way a community accommodates any condition that presents itself as permanent and unavoidable, not with loyalty, but with the pragmatic cooperation of those who have calculated that resistance costs more than compliance. Bumpy did not threaten them. He visited them, individually, without announcement, in the same unhurried manner with which he had been moving through the neighborhood since his return. He sat in the back rooms of barber shops and the storage areas of small grocery stores and the kitchens of restaurants. And he spoke with people he had known for decades in the tone of a man who is simply informing a friend of a relevant fact. "I'm back," he told each of them, in variations on those 2 words that were each calibrated to the specific person he was addressing and the specific nature of that person's connection to Caruso's operation. "Whatever arrangement you have right now, you have a different option. No pressure, no deadline, just an option." 2 words. A different option. It was, in a sense, the entire argument, because for people who had spent 11 years inside an operation built on the absence of alternatives, the existence of an alternative was not a minor development. It was a fundamental change in the structure of the situation they were living inside. Over the following 4 months, the withdrawals began, not simultaneously, not dramatically. One supplier stopped extending credit on terms that had previously been automatic. One intermediary became unavailable when Caruso's collectors needed coordination. One local business owner whose location had served as an operational point began developing scheduling conflicts that made his premises less reliably accessible. Each withdrawal, individually, was explainable as ordinary business variance. Collectively, they represented a hemorrhage in Caruso's operational capacity that his ledgers began recording as a sustained and worsening trend. The cause of which his people could not identify because it had no single cause. It was the aggregate effect of dozens of individual human decisions made by people who had simply been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the moment when a genuine alternative presented itself. By the end of the 4th month, the financial output of Caruso's Harlem operation had declined by nearly half. The physical infrastructure was intact. The organizational chart remained technically unchanged, but an operation is not its infrastructure and it is not its organizational chart. It is the living cooperation of the people who make it function, and that cooperation quietly, much visibly. One person at a time was withdrawing itself from the arrangement that Caruso had believed was permanent. Caruso understood, by this point, that the situation had changed in ways that his initial assessment had failed to anticipate. He understood that Bumpy Johnson had been doing something during those 4 months of apparently innocuous neighborhood walking, and that whatever it was had produced consequences that were now materially affecting his business. What he did not fully understand, what he could not have understood, because understanding it would have required him to think about Harlem as something other than a market, was the mechanism by which it had happened, or the degree to which it was now irreversible. He requested a meeting. The message arrived through an intermediary, framed with the particular care that men in their world used when they wanted a meeting to appear less coercive than the circumstances actually made it as an invitation rather than a summons. Extended between equals rather than demanded by a man who still controlled more armed personnel than his counterpart. Bumpy accepted. He sent back word through the same intermediary, with the same care and the same apparent courtesy, that he would be available on Thursday afternoon. He arrived alone. The room where Caruso was waiting contained 10 men besides Caruso himself, positioned with the studied casualness of people who want their presence to read as ordinary while communicating something specific about the consequences of making the wrong decision. Bumpy walked in, looked at the room without any visible reaction to its configuration, crossed to the chair across from Caruso, and sat down in the manner of a man who has arrived for a conversation he has been looking forward to. He did not acknowledge the 10 men along the walls. He did not look at them. He looked only at Caruso, with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has long since decided what this moment means and requires nothing from it except the opportunity to be clear. Caruso began speaking about arrangements, about the practicalities of operating in Harlem, about the possibility of a structure that could accommodate both of them in a way that served everyone's interests. His voice was controlled, his language was precise, and the argument he was constructing was the logical argument of a man who still believed, despite 4 months of contrary evidence, that the situation was fundamentally a negotiation rather than a conclusion. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When Caruso finished, Bumpy reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. On it were names. Not many 17. Precisely each one a person currently inside Caruso's operational structure, who had been in private communication with Bumpy over the preceding 4 months. Not spies, not planted informants, not people Bumpy had recruited or pressured or turned against their employer. Simply people who had, of their own accord and without any solicitation, made contact with Bumpy Johnson because they had looked at the trajectory of the situation they were inside and drawn the rational conclusion about where it was heading. Caruso looked at the list. He took his time with it, reading each name with the careful attention of a man who is recalibrating every assumption he has made about the state of his own organization. When he reached the end of the list, he looked up. The room was completely still. 10 armed men, and none of them moved, because each of them was performing the same private calculation, understanding that the piece of paper on the table was not a threat in the conventional sense, but something considerably more final. A demonstration that the ground beneath the entire operation had already shifted in ways that could not be undone by any action taken in this room on this afternoon. Bumpy sat across from Caruso and held his gaze with the absolute composure of a man for whom the outcome of this moment had never genuinely been in question. Outside, Harlem continued its afternoon, its conversations, its commerce, its accumulated daily life entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room, and yet constituting, in every conversation and every transaction and every small human exchange occurring on its streets, the very force that made every weapon in the room irrelevant. Caruso did not give the order. The silence stretched until it had said everything that needed saying. And then Bumpy stood, straightened his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who has nowhere he needs to be quickly, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, turned back, and looked at Caruso one final time. "You can keep the territory," he said, in the even conversational tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering a concession. "But you can't keep the people." Caruso did not answer. The 10 men along the walls did not move, and in the silence that filled the room after Bumpy Johnson walked out of it, every person remaining understood with the complete and unambiguous clarity that only arrives when an argument has been made that admits no reply, that the silence itself was the most honest thing Vincent Caruso had said since the evening he hosted New York's underworld at a table on West 116th Street and believed, with the confidence of a man who has never encountered the limit of his own intelligence, that the story he was telling was the only one being written. It was not. It had never been. And somewhere on the street outside, walking back toward Harlem at his own pace, Bumpy Johnson already knew exactly how the next chapter ended. Vincent Caruso left Harlem the way a tide withdraws without announcement, without confrontation, without a single word of explanation offered to anyone who might have wanted one. There was no final meeting, no declaration of terms, no dramatic scene in which one man acknowledged the other's victory and the ledger was formally closed. The offices that had operated under his direction simply closed, one by one, over the course of several weeks, each closure explained to the people immediately affected as a routine adjustment, a temporary reorganization, a matter of logistics rather than retreat. The men who had worked under his management scattered in the quiet, practical way that people scatter when the structure they have been operating inside loses its coherence, not fleeing, not making statements, simply redirecting themselves toward whatever came next in a world where Caruso's Harlem chapter had ended, and no one had officially announced that it had ended because no announcement was necessary. Harlem absorbed his departure the same way it had absorbed his arrival 11 years earlier, not with visible celebration, not with any formal acknowledgement, but with the organic, unhurried process by which a living community fills a space that no longer serves as an obstacle. The familiar faces returned to the familiar corners. The informal networks that had gone quiet or redirected themselves during the years of Caruso's management resumed their natural patterns. The neighborhood did not erupt into relief. It simply, gradually, began to breathe again in the full register of what it actually was, as if a hand that had been pressing down on its chest had been lifted, and the body, remembering its own capacity for expansion, was taking the time it needed to relearn that capacity without making a performance of the process. And in the middle of all of it, on an ordinary morning that carried no particular distinction from any other ordinary morning, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked through the door of the Monarch on West 116th Street, crossed the dining room without hurrying, and sat down at the corner table near the window. His table, the one that had waited, through 11 years of his absence and one era of another man's occupation, with the patient indifference of furniture that has no opinion about who sits in it, but that somehow, through the accumulated weight of association and memory, has become inseparable from a single person's presence. He ordered black coffee. He asked for the morning newspaper. He sat in the particular way he had always sat, unhurried, upright, with the quality of settled authority that does not announce itself because it has no need to. The waiter who served him did not ask where he had been or comment on his return. The people who passed the window and glanced in and recognized the figure at the corner table nodded, some of them simply lifting their chins in the brief, loaded gesture of acknowledgement that means, in the language of people who have known each other a long time, everything that a longer greeting would mean and more. No speeches were made. No glasses were raised in the middle of the morning in a restaurant that was still serving breakfast. There was no ceremony, because the return required none, because the most complete restorations are the ones that look, from the outside, as though nothing was ever interrupted. And Bumpy Johnson understood this with the particular fluency of a man who had been thinking about exactly this moment for a very long time. The story of what he had done traveled outward from Harlem, the way all genuinely significant stories travel, not through official channels or formal documentation, but through the mouths of people who had witnessed pieces of it and needed to tell someone what they had seen. It reached federal prisons in Atlanta and Leavenworth and Marion, carried by inmates who had connections to New York's underworld and who understood immediately what the details meant when assembled in sequence. It reached the organizational structures of Italian families in Lower Manhattan, who had watched Caruso's Harlem operation with proprietary interest and now received the account of its end with the mixture of professional respect and private relief that powerful people feel when someone else demonstrates a capability they themselves would have found difficult to execute. It reached police precincts and federal offices, where men whose careers involved tracking the movements of people like Bumpy Johnson recorded the details in reports that would be filed and eventually read by other men who would understand, regardless of which side of the law they occupied, that what had happened in Harlem between November 1963 and the spring of 1964 represented something worth studying. What those stories consistently emphasized, the detail that each retelling foregrounded, regardless of the teller or the audience, was not any act of violence, because there had been no significant act of violence to describe. There had been no confrontation from which a winner and loser emerged bleeding. There had been no single decisive moment that could be pointed to as the turning point, the way you can point to a specific punch as the one that ended a fight. What there had been was something considerably more difficult to describe and considerably more instructive to understand: a sustained, patient, strategically precise campaign conducted entirely in the register of human relationships and human psychology, by a man who had returned from 11 years of enforced stillness with a clearer understanding of how power actually operates than most people accumulate in a lifetime of active engagement with it. He had not fought for territory. He had fought for memory, and for trust, and for the particular quality of belonging that cannot be manufactured or purchased or maintained by any instrument except genuine presence over genuine time. He had understood, and this was the understanding that made the difference, that separated what he did from what almost anyone else in his position would have attempted, that Caruso's occupation of Harlem was always, at its foundation, contingent. It was contingent on the continued willingness of the community to accommodate it, and that willingness was not a permanent condition, but a temporary one. maintained by the absence of a credible alternative and the presence of sufficient fear to suppress the natural preference for something different. Remove the absence of an alternative. Reduce the fear by demonstrating a different kind of authority, and the accommodation would dissolve on its own. Not immediately, not dramatically, but completely, and without the kind of violent confrontation that would have cost more than it returned and produced a resolution far less durable than the one that patience and intelligence could achieve. This was what Harlem learned from watching Bumpy Johnson reclaim what was his without firing a single shot. It was what the underworld learned from hearing the story retold across the geography of American prisons and criminal organizations, and it was ultimately what Vincent Caruso himself learned in whatever private moment of honest reckoning the evidence suggests he eventually permitted himself sitting somewhere in Brooklyn, in an office that was not on West 116th Street, processing the sequence of events that had produced his departure from a neighborhood he had believed, with complete sincerity, that he had permanently acquired. The lesson was not comfortable. It never is. When the thing you have built your understanding of power upon turns out to be insufficient to the situation you actually face. Caruso had been right about almost everything about the opportunity that Bumpy's arrest created, about the method of acquisition that would be most effective, about the operational architecture required to manage what he had acquired. He had been wrong about one thing only. He had been wrong about what Harlem actually was. He had treated it as a market and discovered, at considerable cost, that it was a community, and that the difference between those two things, which had appeared academic from a distance, turned out to be the only difference that mattered. Bumpy Johnson was not a legend because he was the most dangerous man in any room he entered, though there were years and rooms in which that was true. He was not a legend because he had built something larger or more profitable than what other men in his world had built. He was a legend because he had demonstrated, in the most practical and irreversible terms available, something that power in every form, visible and invisible, legal and otherwise, in boardrooms and in neighborhoods and in every human structure where some people hold authority over others, consistently resists. Learning that territory is not measured in boundaries. It is measured in the people who choose to stand with you when you have nothing left to offer them except the truth of who you are and the record of how you have treated them when it was within your power to treat them differently. That is the only measure of authority that persists. Everything else is temporary. Everything else is contingent. Everything else, given sufficient time and the right kind of patience, can be walked back by a man who understands that the ground beneath apparent power is always, in the end, made of people, and that people, unlike territory, cannot be purchased. They can only be earned. Bumpy Johnson sat at his corner table at the Monarch on West 116th Street, drank his black coffee, read his morning newspaper, and nodded at the people who passed the window. He had been gone for 11 years. He had come back with nothing except everything that mattered, and Harlem, which had never stopped being his in the way that truly counts, simply continued its mourning around him as if the lion had never left, and the chair had never been empty, and the story had always been heading with the unhurried certainty of something that was always going to be true. Exactly.